Welcome to Rad Futures. Today I'm going to be talking with Ryann Liebenthal. Ryann, you obviously wrote the book Burdened: Student Debt and the Making of an American Crisis, which was published by HarperCollins in 2024. I know from our little talk before I started recording that, you kind of stepped away for a little bit, as have I for my own reasons. But why don't you tell me, for the viewers, who don't know who you are, why don't you talk a little bit about your book? What do you talk about in your book? What's the conclusion you came to? How do you feel about that experience writing it? And then, yeah, we'll just kind of wing it.
Sure. And thanks also for reaching out.
Right.
Um, yeah, so to kind of give a broader origin story, I guess. I was working in New York at Harper's Magazine for several years. I started working there not long after finishing a grad program in global journalism, basically, at NYU, through which I racked up a bunch of debt, right at a time when journalism, and particularly, international reporting, sort of foreign correspondent work, really took a nosedive. So I ended up going in this kind of magazine route, working on the editorial side of things. And when I was at Harper's, it's a 501(c)(3) nonprofit, which is kind of rare for a magazine. And the pay is excruciatingly bad. But as a result, I qualified for this program that was enacted in 2007 called Public Service Loan Forgiveness, or PSLF. For a time, I also actually didn't make enough to be required to make a monthly payment. So I had either a $0 payment or some kind of nominal amount. But my loans were big enough that I kept, I was accruing a lot more interest than that. So during this time, I was kind of hedging my bets, and by this point, there was a form that you could actually fill out, send in, to be kind of ruled qualified or not to enter into this public service loan forgiveness program. Each year, they suggested that you send in this form that your employer had to sign, verifying that you worked full time and that, it was a qualifying institution. So I did that, and my loans were automatically transferred from whatever loan servicer they were with to this company called Fed Loan Servicing, which
Mhm.
I can go into more later. But they were at the time the only loan servicer that was given the contract to do this PSLF program. And I kept making these payments, even though I wasn't always required to try to cover interest, because I was like, I don't know, to get PSLF, you had to be working for 10 years
Yeah.
in a qualifying nonprofit. And it was like, well, am I going to work at Harper's for 10 years? Probably not, but so I'll just keep paying as much as I can to try to cover interest at least, while also kind of hoping for this thing to help me in some way. And I kept sending in my form on a yearly basis. And after one of the years, I sent in this form, and it came back telling me that only four of my payments that year had qualified.
Yeah.
And and at the time, the job was kind of taking a lot out of me, so it was like just completely intolerable to me that I would be working this job, and have it kind of not be worth even this one kind of benefit. And so I called up the servicer company, and they told me that when my loans had been switched from the previous servicer to them, uh, I had automatically been entered into something without my knowledge called paid ahead status. So
Hmm.
all this extra amount that I was paying was not going to pay down any principal. It was only going to advance my due date. And at a certain point, it advanced my due date so far that I sort of lapped myself, and I didn't
Yeah.
have a due date, and therefore I didn't have a payment. And so because a payment wasn't due, they weren't counting any of the payments I made.
Mm.
So it's just this weird kind of like, you know, I would almost say Kafkaesque situation.
Sure.
And I think I finally managed to claw back at least some of those qualifying payments. Although I've ta spoken since to a number of people who had the same issue and were never credited for the payments.
Yeah.
So I just had this sense that like this program is a complete shit show. And as the 10-year anniversary came up in 2017, I just had a strong hunch that it was going to go very badly for this first cohort of people who would be eligible. And at the time I was by that point I was freelancing. I was trying to do my own writing and reporting and also editing and copy editing for kind of more stable income. So I pitched this story to follow the kind of first cadre of people under this program to be eligible and also discuss all the problems that people were facing with it to someone I knew at Mother Jones. And apparently it was kind of a generational thing in the editorial meeting. Like the younger people really wanted to do it, and the older editors, the sort of like Gen X age editors, didn't quite get the issue, didn't see it as a
Oh,
big enough story.
weird. God. Yeah.
And that was 2017. So the story just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I ended up reporting it over 8 or 9 months, and got into, found a lot of issues, talked to a lot of people who were having really serious problems, and I ended up getting a lot into the history of the student loan program too, which I quite honestly hadn't known that much about
Yeah.
on a kind of granular level. And so the piece ended up being a lot longer than it was first commissioned at. So it was like 8,000 words or something. And it became their cover story that summer of 2018. Um, and then right around then, also, this statistic came out that, and I can't remember the exact number because it has changed. It has been like corrected since, but effectively, more than 20,000 people had applied for forgiveness that first year, and somewhere on the order of 100 received it. So the failure rate was more than 99%. And and so it was just very, and so in many cases, the people who applied didn't qualify, but
Yeah.
even the fact that they thought that they did suggests that there was at the very least a huge failure of communication from the federal government about this. And so from there, I, my spouse actually suggested that I try to come up with a book proposal and do something bigger on student loans, kind of springboarding off of that article and all the research I'd done. And so I found an agent kind of through my social circles and managed to come up with this proposal and sell it. And that was early 2019.
Okay.
Um, at the time, I also, unbeknownst to most other people, was pregnant. And then we ended up moving to California. I had my baby in September of 2019, and I was sort of just getting back into the swing of things when everything shut down again. And so then the baby came back from his childcare situation, and I was really slowed down a lot. And also, I had intended to do a lot of kind of first person on the ground reporting, which I think probably would have been harder than I realized anyway because of the baby, but had become basically impossible because of the pandemic, at least to do it in the way I wanted to do it. So I pivoted a lot toward this historical research angle. And I also just kind of generally enjoyed that work. To be honest, more than reporting,
Yeah.
I found some kind of comfort in digging into these historical records, the even the tedium of reading, thousands of pages of congressional hearing testimony, was sort of soothing. In this particularly weird time.
Yeah.
And so I ended up focusing a lot on that angle. And I went into the project, I knew student debt was a problem. I felt that it was bad. It certainly personally was bad for me. Uh, but I didn't really know what the deal was or why it had become such a big issue, so kind of monstrously debilitating for, frankly, like a whole generation of people or more.
Yeah.
Um, and so it was kind of like taking a college course that I was also designing at the same time. That's sort of what writing the book felt like. Like I was coming up with the syllabus as I was learning the thing. So I was just reaching far and wide. And in the end, I kind of decided that if you really trace it back, you have to start somewhere. Uh, to me, the sort of origin of the track that set us on the path to where we are now was the GI Bill of 1944, even though there is not a student loan component in that. And in fact, it was very generous. Um, the way that it structured this education aid, which was on an individual level, so not funding state agencies or individual institutions even, but funding individual people, veterans who were deemed worthy of this aid because of their service,
Mm.
um, kind of set up this uh, structure, this framework for giving out education aid that really became entrenched as the years went on. And as the grants turned to loans, that becomes a more pernicious way of distributing money to people. And I can go more into detail about why, but that's sort of the basis of where I source the problem is
Okay.
in that. Yeah.
Which is really interesting because lately I've been talking with veterans who've been harmed. Because as you've said, uh, and I didn't know that, so thank you. That's very interesting. The GI Bill sort of spearheaded this whole or inspired this whole financial or education aid, machine, I guess, what became eventually this machine of loans. Um, the veterans that I've been talking to lately have been harmed so egregiously by this corrupt system. Um,
Hmm.
and it's fascinating that that's where it started. And but to then to look to zoom out and then see on a macroscopic level what it's become, is really disappointing and um, frankly difficult. I think anyone who, and I'm sure you have plenty to say along these lines, but anyone who spends any amount of time, on a daily basis, immersing themselves in the student loan debt issue, um, it's easy to become very exhausted very fast. It's very, very depressing as a topic to deal with because I just feel, how do you feel? I mean, I feel like, after all the interviews that I've done with people, and we're talking, you know, this is one thing, one thing I have to keep coming back to this in every interview, right? Is the creation of the narrative around the issue. There is this dominant narrative that has been, in my opinion, purposely constructed to toe the line that the lenders and the politicians who are in their pockets want everybody to believe. And that, part of that narrative is that you made the choice, right? You're a student loan lender, you made the choice. How stupid are you for even considering going to university? Why didn't you go to trade school? And, these kinds of things. And Twitter or X is a great example, or if, I'm sure there's other places around the internet where you can find the same sort of bots, Reddit, let's say Reddit. These very scripted narratives. It's so scripted, and they're always regurgitating the same lines. And it's obvious that it's not coming from a real person because it's the same stuff over and over and over. and they attack people anytime anyone says anything critical about this program. They are attacked with bots and then shadow banned and whatnot. My channel is a great example of that.
Hmm.
I've been doing these interviews for many years, and the majority of them have been done this year. And for some reason, it's like the traffic has been completely slowed down, and I don't
Hmm.
know why that is.
Hmm.
So
That's interesting. Yeah.
it is. I mean, so, you stepped away for good reason. I'm sure you totally needed a break because this stuff it's daunting, it's exhausting when you sit back and you think about how many people are being harmed. There are over 43 million people in this country that are beholden, that are beholden to the banks, and the politicians who we vote in, but they don't do anything to really help anybody in this regard. What is your take on the construction of the narrative, or do you think that's even a thing? Do you think we'll ever see any progress on this issue? Because I think that, with the way the economy is right now, with all of the laws that are being passed, and who knows what's going to be passed in the next couple of years, stripping things like Medicaid and food share and these kinds of things. A lot of people who are student loan borrowers also qualify for government assistance because they're not making a lot of money. They're not making enough. As you said, you didn't even make enough. You did the
Yeah.
PSLF. So it's like, are we going to see any progress? Is anyone in this country, are the 43 million borrowers who in my opinion, this is a much bigger group actually than 43 million because we're talking about immediate family members.
Hmm.
Each one of these borrowers has children, a spouse, a father, a mother, someone that they're helping to take care of in some way, including themselves. So if they are,
Or who is helping them?
or who's helping them, you know? Yeah. So what do you think? I mean, do you see any light at the end of the tunnel? Do you think that there is a way to move this forward as a movement that will be successful? I don't know.
In terms of the narrative, I would say one thing that I was really struck by and still am is just the really fundamentally mixed messages that kind of coalesce around this issue, and that goes back decades too. So, talking about the GI Bill, it really brought higher education to the masses. Before that, people weren't on a regular basis going to college. Of course, that was mostly male population, almost 100%. It was like 98% male to benefit. And so, there's that. It was also largely white. Um, and uh, and the GI Bill also, and I'm sure you talked about this with veterans, because this is still an issue today. And even in that time, it attracted a lot of hucksters. So for-profit schools that would just kind of show up, steal people's money, and then shut down.
Yeah.
Um, but so after that point, higher education is kind of a different prospect in the American conversation, really. And that kind of just grows and grows until in the 60s, um, Lyndon Johnson passes this, the Guaranteed Student Loan Program, which is the student loan program as it was until really the Obama years.
Mhm.
Um, and so that's a bank-based program. The banks loan out the money. The government sort of backstops that money and makes the banks more or less whole if the student skips out on their loan, which was really just a budgeting trick because then the only expenses that show up on the budget at that time were any subsidies paid to the banks and any default payments. So it looks a lot cheaper than another kind of system. And then that is kind of both in response to and an attempt to push forward this notion of mass higher education,
Mm.
that you have the baby boomer generation coming into college. They want to go to college. They're graduating high school in greater numbers than anyone before. And you have the development of all these state public university systems that are making it possible for people. Community colleges, especially in California, become start to become a really big thing. And the federal government is really trying to get the universities to partner with it in making higher education something that is achievable for everyone. So the messaging is, go to college. And I think that was the dominant message for basically 50 years. Go to college. It's worth it. Even if you have to take out loans, it's
Yeah.
worth it. Because, there's this idea of the wage differential that you're going to have with a college degree. So yes, you'll have debt, but you'll be able to pay it off because you'll be making, $1 million extra dollars over your lifetime. And I think for a certain amount of time that probably was true. I don't think that that means that the student loan program was the correct choice in the first place. But I think it became especially pernicious, kind of around well, after the 80s and then around the turn of the 21st century when the proposition that it would be worth it and that you would make so much more money that the debt didn't matter, I think shifted. And for many people, that's just patently untrue,
Yeah.
for a number of reasons. And so I think there's this, even today, this mixed messaging of, college is important. Obama had this goal, effectively a goal for everyone to go to college. Everyone should go to college.
Yeah.
And college is a necessity for certain, many, white collar professional fields. Um, Even if a college degree does not necessarily represent training for that particular field.
Mhm.
It's still kind of a credential you need on paper just to get your foot in the door.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it's become wildly unaffordable, both on a tuition level, even in public systems, and on a debt accumulation level. And so to encourage people to go to college and to make it a necessity and encourage that too. And then to turn around and say, well, it's your fault and you shouldn't
Mhm.
have done it and you made a bad choice, um, is hypocritical and cruel too. I mean, I think it's just like,
It's gaslighting.
yeah, sure, yeah. And I think in many cases it's also, some of the talking points just aren't correct. And I'm in some ways almost like pleased, not pleased, but vindicated to see that, there was this whole era of learn to code. And it would be like,
Yeah.
well, you probably shouldn't have gotten a women's studies degree because,
Yeah. Yeah.
you should have been learning to code. And it's like, well, actually, when everybody learns to code, this is part of the problem. You cannot predict the global, national, or even local economy even, a few years ahead.
Mhm.
So if you're trying to get a degree for something that's going to be lucrative in 4 years, 10 years, 20 years, you're taking a stab in the dark, really. And so to do that for something you don't enjoy, you won't necessarily be good at, and that may or may not even be profitable in the future, like that's a very strange incentive structure to create for people as well.
Yeah.
And so all these people who say learn to code um, have been effectively proven wrong because that is exactly what has happened. Too many people learn to code.
Mhm.
And the industry is also shifting away from the employment that it had before. And so it's not a lucrative field anymore. And there was something I read recently that was like, currently the best major, the people who are getting jobs the fastest are like anthropology majors or something. So it's not the traditional narrative is not correct.
Yeah.
And so I think it's very intentionally vindictive and cruel to punish people for a narrative that you've not only created backtracking on the exact opposite narrative, but also doesn't even hold water. It's just a way of saying we don't like you. You shouldn't have, we don't like debtors. We don't like them. And I think you can go further and say we don't like poor people. If
Yes.
you can't pay for college, you shouldn't go to college. And I think that is the ultimate goal, really,
Yep.
is to get the poor people out of college because it's not for them,
Yeah.
according to particularly, I would say, conservatives.
Yeah.
They want the Ivies back.
Yes, they do. And it's been historically gate kept by the elite and white men.
Hmm.
So I think it's really everything that you've said it so nicely and so concisely. I really feel like it's narcissism. It's like narcissistic, neoliberal, capitalist philosophy or approach to, I guess, dealing with social, perceived social ills or something,
Hmm.
It's very narcissistic. It's like, okay, encourage people to go. If this was a domestic partnership, right? Where one person was like, hey, I really think you should do this. This would be in your best interest. I'm telling you this because I care. I care about you. Then you go and you do it because you're like, they really care about me. I'm going to follow their advice. I'm going to take that seriously. You go, you do it, you come back, and you're ridiculed and you're taunted and you're told that they will continue to punish you and ridicule you for making the choice that they told you to make, which is gaslighting,
And
like
yeah,
abusive. Um,
I think another element of it that I hadn't touched on is we've been conditioned, and you sort of got at this earlier, we've been conditioned to think that this is just the way things are. It's just
right,
like, well, it's kind of like with American healthcare. Like no one else on the planet does it that way.
right.
And yet we're just like, well, yeah, that's just what it is. It's just a crushing unforgiving system. And yeah, student loans, they just if you went to grad school, it's just an 8% interest rate because that's what that's what it was. And like none of that makes any sense. There's no reason it needs to be that way. And there's so many other models from other places and even, from people just proposing things within the United States that would make so much more sense than the way we do it. And I think the one thing that still gives me hope, a bit less hope now than before, is that our system had really ossified, I think. And this pathway that had been carved out for more than half a century, um, just really kind of led in this one bad place and just got worse and worse and worse. And the one kind of upside of the crisis itself is that it creates momentum to break the thing that is already failing. So just, break down
Mhm.
the broken system and make space for something new and better to come in. Now, I see to some degree that happening with the Trump administration, but they're not replacing it with something better. They're just breaking it for the sake of breaking it.
Mhm.
Um, but I guess the only sort of, twinkle of hope I have from that is that there is still some opportunity that lies within there to come in with something better.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know that I'm particularly hopeful that is going to happen, but there's at least, some kind of opening there that wasn't there before.
Yeah.
I'm not giving Trump credit for that. I'm just saying, um,
Yeah.
this system has become so broken that it can't sustain itself.
Yeah. I guess one of the other things that I was curious to pick your brain on was this issue around I guess something that I started digging more into the history myself, and I was kind of taken back by what seemed to me to be some intersections between the rise in education aid and the rise in the numbers of minorities and women who are enrolling in higher education. So as we see, from what I've read, from what I've seen, and you can totally disagree with this, and I don't know, you probably know more than I do, but from what it seems to me is that the rise in those numbers correlates with the rise in the ballooning of this type of debt. Um, and so I am kind of stepping back and I'm saying, maybe when do we start asking ourselves if there's any intentionality behind that correlation? As we said earlier in the interview, and as you pointed out, the history of this, and the academies particularly have been sort of gate kept, by certain types of people, and there's a class issue. And, they want the Ivy Leagues back. So, at what point, do we step back and ask that difficult question of intentionality? And, I feel like we're living in a very interesting time, obviously, with everything going on with, people trying to prevent the release of the Epstein files and whatnot. Elites, I feel, people are starting to realize a lot about a lot of things. And, what we once called conspiracy maybe 20, 25, 30 years ago today is maybe not so far-fetched, So what do you think? Do you think there's intentionality behind this, or do you think it's completely random? Do you think it's coincidental that these two things correlate?
I don't think it's coincidental. I do think there's intentionality. I mean, there almost explicitly is in some ways with, you have the Powell memo, for instance, that Lewis Powell writes, and this is kind of at the rise in the age of the rise of these conservative think tanks, which this Powell memo was helping to push forward, saying we need a conservative intellectual class. These think tanks need to be created and, in some cases, revived, re-energized to provide that kind of conservative counterpoint to the so-called, liberal academic stronghold. And very specifically, let's effectively tear down the, you know, the ivory tower. And
Yeah.
I think you see in some ways the very culmination of that now. And it makes a lot of sense because the plan that kind of came out of that Powell memo uh, became something called Mandate for Leadership, which was a sort of Heritage Foundation constructed policy playbook for the first Reagan year. And they kept creating a new edition every year. And so what we know of as Project 2025 is really just the 2025 edition of the Heritage Foundation's Mandate for Leadership.
Yeah.
Um, and you just see today a greater willingness by conservatives and those in power to adhere very strictly to that playbook. I think Reagan certainly would have wanted to, but there wasn't quite the appetite then to do everything that they wanted. So there is that. There is like some very literal, explicit intentionality to, you know, a kind of destruction of what conservatives see as pernicious liberal um, cabal or something. I think the question of intentionality with respect to, you know, rising debt burdens for women and minorities and and the at the same time their rising academic involvement is a little trickier. I think there is still intentionality. Like I think the Heritage Foundation is kind of conspiratorial, like they literally want to do that.
Mhm.
I think what happened with education, the story of women and minorities, I think, is just so long and so piecemeal in many ways that it's a little harder to ascribe a really strong, vector of intentionality. But what I think happened, and this is just my interpretation, is at the time that you have this big opening up of education to wide groups of people, um, that includes a lot of people, women actually were fairly well represented in the academy even before uh, the mass university movement, but it didn't represent a very large number of women. So you see a lot more women being able to go to school than had been before. After the Civil Rights Act is passed, you have a lot more opportunity for Black Americans and those from the South in particular to access institutions that they just literally would not have been allowed to. I mean, you even see other things like the ending of Jewish quotas, various kinds of openings up to wide groups of people. And there's obviously a backlash to that. So you see in the 60s, there's this student movement that starts in California. It's partially in response to the Vietnam War. It becomes more and more about the Vietnam War as it goes on, and other, kind of flashpoints of American politics at the time, and spreads across the country and becomes this huge source of protest and kind of division, generational division in the country. And one strain of the population reacts to this by basically saying, these are undeserving people. So, like in California, you have all these hippies going to public universities almost for free. They're functionally guaranteed an education, they don't have tuition. And there's a very well developed system. So there's universities, there's state colleges, and there are community colleges, and pretty much anybody who graduates high school can go to one of these institutions. And then the students start protesting and they start occupying buildings and getting into clashes with the police. Reagan ends up sending in the National Guard at one point, and a person dies in one of these protests who incidentally was not even involved in the protest. And a portion of the California population says, we need to basically get these people out of the institute. Like we shouldn't be paying for them to go to school.
Yeah.
And Reagan also says this specifically, like we don't want to subsidize intellectual curiosity, essentially. Um, and so there's this big movement against that liberalization of education, and by liberalization I mean the kind of opening up of it to various groups of people. And you see that in different forms. In California, something that starts several years later is called the tax revolt, which results in a change in property tax law here in California that ends up changing the funding structure mostly for K to 12 schools, but that has an impact directly on community colleges and indirectly on university funding. And you see the rise of tuition. And this tax revolt also spreads across the country. And so there have always been, I think, these kind of waves of expansion and retraction. And that's the big one that sort of started it, in my opinion. And then at the same time that, the public kind of turns against uh, public subsidy for
college students.
Mhm.
You also see, and this persists to today, women and minorities do not start off on the same foot as white men.
Yeah.
So that's on a wealth basis. Black families, typically Black students enter college with um, the last statistic I knew was 1/8 the family wealth of white students. So just in order to be able to go to school, they're necessarily going to have to reach into a different funding stream. They
Yeah.
don't have money just sitting around. So that ends up, if there's available money, what is available? It's going to be student loans. And, it used to be grants. There was a while where the Pell Grant could effectively fund
Yeah.
you going to a public university without really requiring it much or any debt.
Hmm.
That's not true anymore. We've expanded loans far ahead of grant money,
Yeah.
and that's intentional also. And so there's this wealth issue. There's also then for both groups a wage differential.
Hmm.
So a college graduate woman or a Black man makes less than a white man,
Hmm.
just right off the bat. So there's this kind of incentive, and this I would say is not intentional in the same way, but there's an incentive to credentialize further because effectively, it's like a white man's BA is a woman or a Black man's, uh, master's degree.
Hmm.
Well, one
Yeah.
of those ends up being a lot more expensive than the other and putting you in farther into debt. So you go out into the workplace with a kind of deficit
Hmm.
and earn less. So there's kind of this double whammy. And I think that, if not intentional, is certainly not something that people are, that a certain um, cadre of people, and particularly Republicans in power, they're not eager to fix that. In fact, we see the movement going in the other direction.
They're not.
So,
Yeah.
and I think also it fits into that same kind of punitive, or you called it gaslighting model, where it's like, well, you shouldn't have gone.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
and your worth is determined after the fact by the fact that you needed debt to do it in the first place.
yeah. No, that's really interesting what you just said, and I have not. I don't know that I've thought about it that way, and I haven't talked to anyone who's mentioned that either. So thank you. You said there seems to be this incentivizing, at least for women and minorities, to credentialize further in order to make up for that gap, that wage gap, that
Hmm.
when we enter the workforce, that's what we meet. We're still sitting below what a white man with a BA is getting or allowed or given or whatever in terms of opportunity. So that is a really good way to think about that. And I thank you for that because that actually helps. That helps. That helps make some sense of some things.
I think it's also psychological.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like sometimes, for instance, people will talk about how women don't negotiate their pay when they go into a job.
Yeah.
And then you find, and it's like, well, because they're afraid, they really need to get over it, they need to just do it. And then you hear about how when women do try to negotiate their pay, they just don't get the job. So it's both psychological, socialized, but also entirely rational. Like I think women and minorities, people who aren't given the same advantages, feel the need to prove their worth further.
Oh, yeah.
And this realm, it's by getting a more credentialized. You're really an expert. You really know what you're talking about. That's a psychological and emotional reality, but it's also rational. It makes sense on an income basis.
It's an economic buffer, or maybe like a moat or something. I don't know.
Hmm. Yeah.
It's some kind of
It's
some
a
kind of
protective,
yeah, it's a
yeah.
protective mechanism to prevent, I guess that wage discrimination, to kind of act against that in some way. That's really interesting because as Lisa Ansell, I don't know if you saw the interview I did with her, but as she said in one of her interviews with me recently, she was talking about women and student loan debt, and she said Black women in this country are the most highly educated, and again, going back to what you just said, that makes sense, right?
Hmm.
I mean, when we're talking about social class, oh, well, why don't people like, the Heritage Foundation and these sort of conservative think tanks and people who are in the Republican Party or whatever, like, why don't they would never even they would hear an argument like this, but I doubt they would even allow it to finish because they're not interested. They're not interested in uh, anyone talking about anything having to do with gender, because now conveniently for them, they can conflate it with the trans issue, because I feel like that those two things for them kind of work nicely to cancel each other out.
I think there's also, it's just like there's a real antipathy to any kind of structural explanation
Yeah.
for inequality. So even when faced with data like that, I think the response tends to be the rebuttal is all individualistic. So it's like, well, again, you didn't study the right thing.
Right.
You shouldn't have gone, you could have gone to community college. Um, you should have found scholarships. You should have done something differently, even though, you know, for wealthy people, those questions just aren't even there.
No. No, they're not.
So it's a totally different set of standards and expectations
Yeah.
for people without means, and therefore a greater responsibility and a greater um, op, you know, possibility of judgment.
Yeah. It's um it's wrong. It's morally wrong. So one of the other things I'm interested in is the slabs, the student loan backed securities. A lot of people I've talked to aren't familiar with this. They are not even aware that student loans are sort of involved with Wall Street and the stock market. Um, and then my other question that kind of piggybacks off of that is maybe in a way is I guess if we might be able to trace any foreign involvement in the trading of those securities or in the lending institutions themselves, I think with the Trump administration being interested in sort of protectionism, this might be something they would be interested in is, to what extent is there any foreign involvement involved in the creation of this debt? Um, do we know who's truly at the helm of these lending ships and how they're profiting off of it? So, what are your thoughts on either of those? Do you know anything about slabs?
At this point, the vast majority of student debt is federal. So right now, that means that most of it is held or is owed to the Treasury, basically. And the people who collect that are servicing companies, but they're taking a cut from the government based on the number of accounts they service, and there's a whole like formulary. They get so much money for every active account per month. It's kind of like a flat rate situation. So they're not paid more based on the size of any individual loan. So in that regard, I don't, slabs don't really come into play for that type of debt. Um, my understanding is that about 10% of the debt is private loans.
Mhm.
And so those are, bank originated, and they would be, they could be cut into tranches and sold on the secondary market just like anything else. And that's where, slabs do come into play. Sorry.
Yeah.
I have never actually heard of or thought about the idea of foreign investment. So yeah, I don't really know anything about that. I haven't heard anything about that. It's an interesting question.
Mhm.
I could imagine for that eligible pool, possible. Um, it is a fairly minimal fraction of the amount of money. On the other hand, I think that there is kind of a goal, whether it's being actively pursued or just, it kind of fits in with the general ambitions of the Trump administration to privatize
Mhm.
into, at one point, there was a stated goal, at least within the Project 2025 document, to effectively take all the federal loans and put them back onto the private market. So to basically go back to the system that existed until the financial crisis, when loans were, the Treasury actually bought up a bunch of student loans from banks and then stopped issuing any more loans through the banks and did it all directly from the federal government, the direct lending program. So the Heritage Foundation playbook wants to go back to this commercial lender model that, based on what I've just explained, failed. It had to be bailed out. So it's not a good idea. It didn't work on its own merits. And it's worse for lenders. I mean, it's worse for borrowers. It's worse for the government. It costs more. But I don't know where they're at with. I mean, that's just like one of their stated goals. I don't know what the plan is for any of.
What are you working on now? Can we expect, what can we expect next from you?
I have been kind of half-heartedly working toward another project, not debt related. I won't go into the details because it's still kind of
Yeah.
half-baked. And yeah, I do kind of anticipate doing more reporting on this subject. It's been a little bit of a weird time because there's so many things happening at once that I
Yeah.
think it's hard even to keep abreast of like what's going on, what is the most important topic even within this topic.
Yeah.
And then also I get the sense that editors are just being, sandblasted with stories about all the terrible things happening. So
Yeah.
it's a little hard to break through.
Yeah. I thank you for taking the time out of your day and your schedule to do this. I know you're a busy woman. And I thank you for sharing all of your thoughts, all of your experience. I really appreciated the stuff that you said about incentivizing people to credentialize, because that is a super significant point. I think that goes underlooked, and it's just not, it's not something that people talk about, and it's not really considered. So thank you, and I hope people
Mm-hmm.
do start talking about that in that way,
Mm-hmm.
because it does play into the class divide, and that is getting bigger.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.